But the UAW wasn't founded by asking for permission. The founders of this union didn't wait for the law. They didn't worry about the law. They wanted their dignity and they wanted their fair share, and they did what the hell they had to do to get it. The companies we deal with do not feel bound by the law. Ask a Starbucks worker who's been fired for organizing. Ask a Volkswagen worker in Tennessee whose boss threatened to close the plant if they unionized. Employers don't give a damn about breaking the law if it serves their interest. We've got to aspire to the spirit of our union's founders and the sit-down strikers and the civil rights movement. They knew there's no law that can hold back a united working class. There are no words on paper that will stand in the way of our fight for justice on the job.
Yes, folks. Me on the edit there. Sorry about that, Sean. Down. Sorry, Sean. Didn't mean to play you off like this. So abruptly.
No, it's good. I mean, I love the edit of that video too. Like, I love the guitars playing in the background of that clip. It's pretty good.
I do. Yeah, I like that. I think. Yeah, no, that's a very Left Reckoning. That's our vibe.
That's exactly what we want to see resurrected. And we'll be talking a little bit more actually about Sean in just a few minutes with Paul Prescod. I mean, we got a hell of a show for folks today. Left Reckoning 113, starting to get up there, those numbers. You know, Matt and I are really, really happy to be able to celebrate some good news from today with this letter that was released by Rashida Tlaib, signed by other members of the quote-unquote squad. I mean, a really, really beneficial and exciting moment. We'll be talking to Chip Gibbons about that. I wish, I could have a beer or something to celebrate it, but I guess they don't make beer for straight fellas anymore, Matt. Have you heard this?
Is this about Bud Light?
Bud Light and Coors now, apparently.
Both are union made, right? See, the thing with me is like I'm out. I know we have to keep it tight, but okay. I don't care about any fancy beers. Just give me whatever, like the sort of like $5-6 range, which that's cheap here in New York. I don't remember what it is. I remember it being cheaper in like Fargo, but anyway, give me like Bud Light or whatever in that range, as long as it's one of the ones that's made by a union, and I'm cool with that. So yeah, Bud Light is in. I've had a lot of good time on Bud Light.
Oh yeah, Bud Light's good. Coors is good. No, I mean, if you haven't seen that, you're probably in a better headspace than us, so we can move on. But must be endlessly tiring to be a weird reactionary right winger today. But we're talking about some good news. I mean, this Assange letter is huge. We're going to be talking to Chip in just 1 second about that. Then we're going to be joined by our good friend Paul Prescod to talk about Tony Mazzocchi, who's a very legendary labor leader. And Paul's going to tell us, some of the lessons that he's learned from Tony's work, and also about some of the really exciting movements in the labor movement today. We'll introduce Paul later, but if you haven't been following Paul's work over these past few years, you really should. He's a real asset to this movement. And last up, before we jump over to the post game, patreon.com/Left Reckoning, we're going to go and talk a little bit about something that AOC said on CNN earlier a few days ago about how we should really be challenging the courts, which is something I'm very happy to see. And the more kind of militancy on that question that we can get, as folks know, I'm somebody who wants to see the Supreme Court's power completely curtailed. So seeing those kind of things be brought in the mainstream, I think is good news. And we're going to help continue that point. So yeah, we're stoked to be doing this. Thanks everybody for supporting the show. If you haven't already jumped on to become a patron, it really helps us cover all the things that we cover at patreon.com/Left Reckoning. You can become a Left Reckoner by using this QR code or go on patreon.com/Left Reckoning. And also, if you want some good merch, hang out in style. We have our store live right now, leftreckoning.com/store. You can get a t-shirt or a hat. Definitely helps us out a lot. But without further ado, unless you had anything up top, Matt, I think we should get to Chip. I'll just say before we go live with Chip, the last time I think we had Chip on the show, Matt, we were sort of saying that like it's terrible that we always have to bring Chip on to tell us some bad news in this case about press freedom and free speech in this country. And we sort of joked that maybe the next time we'll have him on, we'll have some good news. Didn't really think it was possible, but thanks to the great work that Chip and others have been doing, they're selling Celebrate today. And let's bring it on.
Yeah, I just to say real quick on that, like the amount of sorry, I should have looked this up. Defending Rights and Dissent is that Chip's group. The amount of work that they do behind the scenes to make stuff like this, because it's not just these politicians decide they want to stand up for Julian Assange, which is a toxic thing to do for Democratic Party operatives. It takes people like Chip and that group working behind the scenes, coordinating a lot of this stuff. So yeah, really great.
Welcome back, everybody, to Left Reckoning. I'm joined by our good friend Chip Gibbons, who is the Director of Policy at Defending Rights and Dissent. Chip, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's always a pleasure to be on Left Reckoning. I'm glad you keep giving me time to talk about the Julian Assange case.
Oh, well, I mean, we're always happy to do it. And, I think the last time we had you on, we had sort of mentioned that we hope the next time we get you on, we can have some good news. And we actually do have some pretty significant and positive news today in the fight for Julian Assange's freedom, which is this new letter that was put out today by Rashida Tlaib that has signatures from people like Cori Bush, Greg Kassar, Jamal Bowman, AOC, Presley, and Ilhan Omar, if I didn't mention her already. Could you talk a little bit about this letter and what it sort of details and what its demands are of the Biden administration?
Yes, it's a really exciting development, and it's historic in multiple ways. This is the first organized effort you've seen by members of Congress beyond sort of stray remarks, calling for the charges to be dropped. I know Ro Khanna has done a live stream and made remarks on television, but you haven't seen him send a letter like this, and he didn't sign this letter for whatever reason. To see a letter being sent to Merrick Garland asking for the charges to be dropped. I have a very particular view of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. I think WikiLeaks was a really important attempt to correct a lot of the mistakes with the media. When WikiLeaks was established in 2007, it had this very innovative idea of let's use encryption, let's use technology to create a platform where whistleblowers, whether they're corporate whistleblowers or government whistleblowers, can anonymously give information to journalists. And the thing that they use, is I'm very technologically illiterate, has since been adopted by a lot of newsrooms. They have secure drops or whatnot. But in 2007, this was a revolutionary idea, and WikiLeaks was really incredibly bold. One of their earliest revelations were about Swiss banks, and a judge tried to take their website down. And you had this standoff over the First Amendment. And this was at a time when a lot of us were very sour on the media because they had acted as cheerleaders for George Bush's illegal war of aggression against Iraq, which of course was based on lies. So you have this really sort of exciting platform. And I think Julian Assange is a fantastic journalist, and the world is a better place because of WikiLeaks. But like on the Hill, they hate him, right? And you're not ever going to probably overcome that. They have all kinds of negative perceptions of him. So getting anyone to say anything about him on the Hill is really hard. And this letter, it focuses exclusively on the First Amendment aspects of the case. So you don't see a lot of lavish praise of WikiLeaks, but you also don't see the opposite of being like when Elizabeth Warren said, Julian Assange is a really bad man who harmed our national security, but we shouldn't throw away the First Amendment to get him. It focuses pretty exclusively on the fact that he released information from Chelsea Manning in conjunction with the New York Times and other papers All of the press freedom groups are against it. They quote very heavily from the press freedom groups, multiple letters to Garland. They quote heavily from newspapers like the New York Times and El País and The Guardian who oppose it. And they quote some of the international pressure here, including from Lula, from the United Nations officials. And they really make the case that you have to drop these charges now and halt this prosecution. And it is a very strong defense of the First Amendment. It calls it a dangerous prosecution. It continuously calls for them to halt it. It doesn't mince words. It takes on the Espionage Act too. It's a very powerful letter.
And like, I mean, I just want to like the text of the letter. People should definitely read through it. We'll have links below for people to do that. But even the way that like Rashida Tlaib like tweeted it out today. The first line of her tweet is 4 years ago today, Julian Assange was arrested for publishing the truth. Right. That's not this kind of mincing of words that we typically get from a lot of politicians in the U.S., at least when it comes to, defending or talking about the concerns about free speech and the Espionage Act. Like this is saying this is somebody who's getting attacked for publishing truthful information. And I just think, as we say every time you have, you on the program, it's like it's really important, I find, to really lead with that fact.
And her press release has comments from press freedom groups that they made just for the letter, including Rebecca Vincent of Reporters Without Borders. And her quote on the letter, on the press release that's on Tlaib's website, is, "No one should face prosecution or the possibility of the rest of their lives in prison for publishing information in the public interest." Like, there's no question that this information that was published by WikiLeaks, with the New York Times, with The Guardian, with El País, with Der Spiegel, was information that was in the public interest. And it's worth reminding people that what Julian Assange is being charged with are the Chelsea Manning revelations. These are the Iraq rules of engagement. These are the Iraq and Afghan war logs. These are the State Department cables. And these are the Guantanamo Bay detaining assessment briefs. There's nothing from 2016 in the indictment. There's nothing about Russia or the DNC. I know those are the two biggest issues in Washington to people, but that's not what he's being prosecuted for. And it's worth noting two things. First, that the DNC tried to sue WikiLeaks over the publishing of the DNC emails, and a judge threw the lawsuit out on First Amendment grounds, and that, Mueller investigated this and found no evidence that could be used against Assange or WikiLeaks to charge them with a crime. So there's, whatever you think of the Hillary stuff, and I'm sort of, bored of the 2016 election. We've had other elections in this country. It has zero relevance to this prosecution, which is solely about exposing war crimes, exposing Guantanamo Bay, exposing the murder of civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan, exposing corrupt State Department backroom deals, like how the State Department pressured Haiti into not raising their minimum wage at the request of U.S. clothing manufacturers.
And I mean, I think like apart from just the language, I think one thing I also want to know, I think it's really exciting, for trying to build a more robust defense of journalism and free speech in this country, to see this kind of unity from Tlaib, AOC, Bush, quote unquote, the squad here all sort of standing together and seeing this as a united front. Could you remind or just like help people understand why now is such an important time to be bringing this up too, apart from just the fact that the historical significance of the date?
Yeah, today is the 4-year anniversary of Julian Assange being arrested in London. He has been in Belmarsh prison ever since then. Belmarsh prison was used during the War on Terror by the UK and was compared to Guantanamo. It's one of the harshest prisons in the United Kingdom. And it's worth pointing out that letters today were sent by parliamentarians in Australia, members of both the UK House of Lords, only time I've ever been excited for something called the House of Lords, and House of Commons, members of both chambers of the Mexican legislature, and by parliamentarians in Brazil. So this was part of a global effort, which is also really historic because you don't see congressional letters like this. And all of the letters were organized independent of one another, but you generally don't see congressional letters, being sent on the same day like this, or congressional letters referencing what's happening in the world. Julian Assange's case is extremely important right now because he has been in Belmarsh prison, one of the harshest prisons in the world, for 4 years. He has been subject to arbitrary detention, according to the United Nations. He has been subject to psychological torture, according to a UN expert. And his case is dragging on. The U.S. is trying to extradite him to this country. And if he's brought here, I don't have a lot of hope for a just resolution of the case. The best thing that can happen is to create the political pressure that prevents the U.S. from finishing the job on this extradition. Initially, the district judge, which is called a DJ in the UK, which I find endlessly amusing, the DJ rejected Julian Assange's press freedom grounds against his extradition, but did rule that prison conditions in this country were repressive and that it would be unduly oppressive to extradite him here. A higher court overturned that. So then a higher court above them, the UK legal system is even weirder than ours, refused to give them permission to appeal or refused to hear the appeal. And now they are making an appeal based on the press freedom arguments the judge rejected. And if the UK courts don't, hear those claims, it will likely go to the European Court of Human Rights, or he could be extradited here. So we are looking at a really dark moment in this case. An Australian commissioner just visited him. Reporters Without Borders was supposed to visit Julian Assange in Belmarsh earlier this week. And when they got there, they were denied entry because, and this is what the prison governor, they have prison governors, not wardens. It's also His Majesty's prison. It used to be Her Majesty's prison, but obviously the Queen is dead. Very sick stuff. His Majesty's prison. The governor of His Majesty's prison told them that they had intelligence that they were in fact not an NGO, but were journalists, and denied them entry. And you saw things like this around Julian Assange's wedding, where one of his guests was denied entry, and they refused to release the photos from the wedding on national security grounds because Julian Assange is dying and he's very sick. And if you saw pictures of him when he showed up on the screen at one of the court hearings, he looks like he's in really bad shape and his health is deteriorating. And I don't know how much longer he can survive under these circumstances. I mean, it's very clear that this is more than an extradition. This is clearly a slow motion assassination against someone whose crime in the eyes of the U.S. government is telling the truth.
Mm-hmm. And again, for people who may not have all the information, y'all can find, I'll put links below as well to some of our other interviews with Chip about just the brutal nature of this extradition attempt, the conditions that he was experiencing when he was holed up in the embassy in London. Really, really frightening stuff from a government that is supposedly ours. And, as Americans, we have a responsibility to push back and fight back against this. And Chip, in the last couple of minutes, some people who are seeing this, they want to continue to help. What are the best places for them to direct their energy now that we have this congressional letter and hopefully some more coverage and support coming for Julian?
Well, if you want to support my organization, Defending Rights Dissent, of course, please visit us at rightsanddissent.org. You can learn about our organization. You can learn about other campaigns we're involved in. We were involved in working with Tlaib's office to get an NDAA amendment that would have amended the Espionage Act to make cases like this impossible or difficult to bring. We were working with Omar's office on behalf to try to get a pardon on behalf of Daniel Hale. Daniel Hale's case is particularly tragic. He's a drone whistleblower. Mm-hmm. He is kept in a communications management unit where his outside communication is deeply restricted. He can't write to people without prior approval from the U.S. government. The FBI listens to all of his calls. And, his crime is that he exposed that during one 6-month period in Afghanistan, 9 out of 10 people killed in our airstrikes were not the intended target, right? So there's all these really horrible cases here. We've been at the forefront of a lot of them, even when a lot of the other DC-based NGOs haven't wanted to touch them. And people on the Hill haven't wanted to touch them. And, when Julian Assange was first indicted 4 years ago, we were up on the Hill talking to people. And here we are now. I know it'd be nice if we had more than 7 members of Congress on this letter. I've been told that a lot of people would like to sign letters like this, but they're afraid to, because Julian Assange has been so demonized, so made so toxic in DC. And the only way we get past that is by supporting the people who have signed this letter and continuing to call for his freedom and continuing to put pressure on our legislators who didn't sign the letter and say, hey, will you make a statement too?
Yes. Exactly. Well, Chip, appreciate having you on as always. Again, folks, there'll be links below for y'all to get more info and to check out Chip's organization. Really appreciate it, and hopefully this is maybe the beginning of a kind of shift in the way that this is going in this country.
It feels historic. It really does. The letters from around the world, the letter from the U.S. Congress, the letters a couple months ago from the editors of the 5 international papers. I mean, we've seen people stepping up. I mean, we're nowhere near where we need to be, but we're a lot better off than we were 4 years ago.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much, Chip.
Thank you.
Well, folks, yeah, I mean, like, look, it's tough because the context and the circumstances around this are so dire. But this is a really positive development. I can't express how important this is, and like I'm very thankful that these members of Congress have finally stepped up and said something about this.
Let's go Ro Khanna, come on.
Yeah, let's get Ro on that. Hopefully it'll continue building up pressure on this, because like this is something that is like as clear as it gets when it comes down to it, that the government is trying to torture somebody for exposing American war crimes. And it really is as clear and as simple as that. And you should be on the right side on this.
I mean, and it is like it's better late than never, but like the slow motion assassination point is accurate. Really depressing. Life ruined. Yeah.
And folks, just saying really quick, below there are links to other interviews that we've done with Chip. We didn't do like the entirety of this case and what Julian Assange has been going through over the past few years. It's all there, though, below in the show notes, as well as ways to check out Chip's organization. Because as you said, I think it's a really important point to make, Matt. With these things, it's like there are people like Chip who are just dedicating their time and their lives to fighting for justice, and are the people who are moving the ball forward on these kind of things. Like these letters and these things don't just happen because somebody in Congress wakes up one day. People are pressuring and pushing, and Chip is certainly one of those people. So if you're able to, definitely support the work that Chip is doing. But well, folks, we are about to bring on our good friend Paul onto the program. Paul, how are you doing, friend?
I'm good. Great to be here.
Paul, really stoked that you're joining us, folks. Paul's a man of many talents. Paul is a former candidate for office. You also know Paul's work on the Jacobin show and Jacobin magazine, and Paul is also an organizer for the Teamsters for Democratic Union. Paul, really, thank you so much for spending some time with us this evening. Yeah,
great to be here. And I got to say, since the last time we hung out in Austin, I can't stop thinking about Texas barbecue.
I'm glad. No, Paul came, and of course it came during another one of our they don't happen all the time, folks, but like a cataclysmic winter storm, and like the entire city was shut down except for a couple places. I think we still had a good time.
And there was,
but when we were there, sorry,
no, there was no precipitation where we were excited.
Dude, I mean, I don't know. This is behind the scenes, but I'm still dealing with the fallout. I had to cut down a tree the other day that came down during the storm. Still dealing with that. But when Paul was here, he was talking about somebody who I think people should know, and that's Tony Mazzocchi, who is a very incredible labor leader. And I figured, this might just be one of many segments where we're sort of looking at Tony's work. But I figured no better person to come on and talk about this than somebody who's one influenced by him, but somebody who actually does this kind of work than Paul. And like, Paul, if you could, for our audience, could you explain to them who Tony is just generally, and maybe why he's such an influence on you and other people on the left?
Yeah, I mean, he really, I think, is one of the great heroes of the left. I think there was an article in Jacobin Kilpatrick wrote about Mazzocchi, and he said, in a future socialist society, we'd have a statue of Mazzocchi. And I definitely think That's true. So, he was a leader in the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, and he really played a big role in many kind of.
Oh no, we're missing Paul. He'll be back in a second. I hear him.
Yeah,
no worries.
there we go. Hey, Paul.
Hey, Paul. Sorry about that.
No worries. He played a key role in many labor battles. So I mean, what he's known for on the one hand is his sort of blend of labor and environmentalism. I mean, he coined the term and the approach of a just transition. So the idea that we have to move away from fossil fuels, but in the process we have to make sure workers are taken care of. And we can maybe get more into this, but he was a World War II veteran and benefited from the GI Bill. And part of the GI Bill, besides being able to go to college for free, you got weekly unemployment benefits for up to a year. And they were pretty generous, and you could stagger them. I mean, you could work 2 months and decide, screw this, I'm going to go on vacation, use the GI Bill for a month, and then go back to work and then use the GI Bill. So he did that. I mean, it's really hard to imagine this today, given the state of our welfare state or lack of it. But he used that, and it was inspired by this idea. I mean, he saw it was possible to do this on a broad scale and said, we should do this for workers, in the chemicals industry, fossil fuel industry, make sure they're paid their same salary. There's different schemes you think about 4 years or something like that while they are transitioned to something new, or, if they're going to be, retired, be able to retire at their full pay. So he kind of coined that term. He was very influential in that. He helped fight to pass OSHA. OSHA was a result of a struggle that Mazzocchi helped to lead. So he was kind of a pioneer in that sense, but also, towards the end of his life, he led the effort to form a labor party in the 1990s. Now, obviously, this was not successful, but it was a very serious effort. I mean, this had real institutional support from the labor movement. A lot of locals and national unions signed on. So, it was a real effort that I think there's a lot to learn from that. But he was really the driving force and leader of that effort. So, I think those kind of two worlds is really, to sum up in short, what makes him so important. But he was also a leader in getting unions against the Vietnam War. That's kind of underplayed in his history. But I think really what stands out is his kind of blend of working class environmentalism that he not only he theorized about. I mean, he didn't really write anything, but he really put into practice and it's kind of ironic because he worked in literally maybe the most toxic industry. I mean, and some of the workers in his union are building nuclear weapons, and he's yet, even though representing them, also talking about, getting rid of nuclear weapons and getting rid of these toxic industries. So kind of incredible to be able to do those two things at the same time. And he was able to do that.
And a lot of the work that he did, I think, is pertinent, not just in the general sense of union organizing, but as you're saying, the environmental stuff. I mean, I'm just borrowing this from, somebody, a friend of the show and a huge influence on me, Matt Huber, in his book, which everyone should read, Climate Change's Class War, that, Tony has this incredible line. He says, why do we treat dirt better than we treat workers? And what he's talking about there is that, when you clean up, I don't know, I put quotations marks over that, but when you clean up, industrial sites, we have all these very strict laws and regulations for how we deal with that. Where is that for the working people? And I think that that's something that has been sort of missing, unfortunately, for a while on the environmental movement, and that Tony, in revisiting his work, really brings it back. But there's another aspect to this, and you wrote an article in Jacobin, Paul, that I think that really brings him back up to a lot of the fights that we're having right now, which is about suburban politics, right? And you have an article in Jacobin, Paul, called how Tony Mazzocchi built worker militancy in the suburbs. And I was just wondering, if you could talk about that a little bit, because this is earlier in his career, if I'm correct, right? The way he was able to do that is unique, and I think is a decent model to start to look at now, when so much of the workforce is sort of in these areas versus in the more traditional urban environment.
Right. Yeah, and I think this really gets back to the principle he had throughout his entire political life. It really was based on the same kind of organizing principle. And I think it's the same principle we should all adopt, is that, you have to be able to build a base first before advancing more radical demands. You got to take care of the day-to-day bread and butter issues. And he was able to do that and be very radical in a way without sounding radical or sounding scary, and just doing it through this basic trade unionism. And that's what he was able to do. Now, I will say, one benefit he had, so we're talking about now the early 1950s. And what makes this kind of incredible is that, 1950s, the, anti-communist hysteria is at its height. You're talking soon after there was purges in the labor movement where a lot of radicals or open communists were purged. And the factory that he had been working in New York City is now moved out to the suburbs, and really for the explicit reason of trying to kind of like suppress this worker militancy. Now, one thing I would say he had on his side was there was a deep working class culture and trade union culture. He's coming of age at a time, in 1945, 35% of U.S. workers are in unions. That is a third of the workforce. Today, it is at 10%. In the post-war World War II strike wave, you have over 4 million workers participated in that. So, and, in a book that was written about him, really incredible book called The Man Who Hated Work and Loved Labor, by Les Leopold, truly one of the best books I've ever read, goes into this. But, he kind of grew up in this dense working class culture, and a lot of people did. So that did help him because the people he's organizing, they still remember that. They're still a part of that. But, he kind of just takes the approach of like, we are going to, first address the shop floor issues, whether that's two-tier wage structure. He also did something I think pretty creative where, they're preparing for a strike in their own shop. They start preparing, over a year in advance. And part of what they do is he sends members to go visit other picket lines. And these, back in the day when a picket line was really a picket line where you're fighting scabs and the cops. But he would send his workers who hadn't been on strike to those picket lines to kind of get that experience, and it increases their confidence. And then management has to see workers coming in late every morning after being on a picket line, some of them bruised up, and it kind of starts to intimidate management, and it gives workers confidence. So, just doing simple things like that. But he also took education really seriously. And another incredible thing he did, he's working mostly with people who didn't even graduate high school. And Mazzocchi himself, didn't go to college, but he did believe deeply that there needs to be an education component. People need to see this as being part of a bigger movement, not just about winning higher wages, but this is part of a bigger transformation that we're a part of. And so he starts a reading group that soon becomes really popular. They're reading Plato's Republic, in the shop, and they're talking about it. People are excited about it. They read a book about the civil rights movement, and that inspired them to start pushing to hire Black workers where they weren't being hired before. So he adds this, educational element that I think really draws people in. And also, he just made organizing really fun. A lot of people talk about this. He was fun to be around. He made things interesting. The book talks about he starts this bowling league that becomes really popular. And, I'll take this moment to say this. I don't want to turn this show into a thing about cancel culture, but this part of the book made me think about, I think on the left, we have a very puritanical culture, if I'm being honest. And, in the bowling league, what was kind of compelling was that it was raunchy. People were getting drunk. There were, I'm not condoning extramarital affairs, but there was, affairs happening. There was sort of a sexual thing to it too. But you could imagine it was kind of a scene where, people are making dirty jokes. It's like funny, it's fun. And I feel like there is a certain puritanical element to the left right now where, I don't know, that environment doesn't really happen, or people don't feel able to do that. But that was, I think, a very big part of the culture was people are having fun. It's a good time. It wasn't overly serious. And so, he just went from the shop floor issues to just getting, I think more and more broad. They start their own health clinic. They're one of the first locals to win dental benefits in the entire country. they start running their own credit union. And then, once he was able to take care and show they could deal with the bread and butter issues, they defeated two-tier proposal, they start winning these amazing benefits. Then he was able to start bringing up broader issues. Then he's starting to hold forums about nuclear testing. He got his members to bring in their kids' baby teeth because they were going to do testing on, the effects of nuclear bomb testing. But it was only after building that base first and showing, and not doing it through sloganeering or being a dogmatic person, but taking care of that first, gaining trust, gaining credibility, and then he was able to go far with that and bring up so many political issues that probably these same members in the past wouldn't have been responsive to. So I think that was a key part of that approach.
Well, I just want to highlight again, if y'all don't mind, just reading from your piece, Paul, how raunchy these bowling parties seem to be. The bowling league was the graveyard for young marriages. It's trained traditional 1950s, which I also think that we have to maybe understand that probably bowling had a different connotation than it does for us today, because I usually don't attribute those bowling to like sexual depravity, but the bowling leagues was.
You've never had a bowling alley affair, David? How well, but I mean, I think like that's interesting. Like the people were hungering for one, like fun, and also like sort of intellectual community. Right, with the like, it's not a surprise. Like all these guys, I can't remember this guy's name, but he's like not Joe Rogan type, but he's like in that sort of crew, and he's always talking about how great it is we have 4-hour conversations, and it's like that's cool, yeah. But it's like when it can be like with people, like fellow workers around like those sorts of ideas, it's a little bit better than just like idly talking about AI or something like the next fad. But yeah, I thought that was a very interesting point and not a surprise. But it's just like now, where do you go to have that kind of fun? Like concerts cost like $400 a piece. Like
right.
I guess there are bowling alleys. Like yeah.
And and I mean, this is something, and it wasn't just Mazzocchi. I mean, I think the unions in their heyday, especially in the 30s, 40s, they were great at thinking about the social lives. So unions had their own baseball leagues, basketball leagues. They would sponsor dances. They understood that was really important. I think it still is. I mean, not to the same degree, but unions are potential sites of that, and it's going to look different. I mean, in Philadelphia, the Teamsters local, they had a thing recently where they had like a video game competition at the union hall as a way to reach some of the younger members. And, it was kind of an experiment. It brought some new people out, but, it can be a really powerful thing. And part of this was a deliberate approach because it used to be, before these unions started growing, the companies dominated the social lives. So the companies would have their own softball leagues that workers would go to, and unions figured out that if we want to kind of take that control from the company, we're going to have to provide our own social spaces. And, I think Tony Mazzocchi did that really well.
I mean, could you talk a little bit more about the political education aspect here too? Because like that's another one that I think on the contemporary left that you get a lot, which is like, like history and theory is effectively like it's for eggheads. It's of no interest to like everyday people, and like any kind of like feeling that like that should be like a part of a socialist program. It's just trying to be exclusive, trying to keep people out. I mean, could you talk about how Tony was able to set something out that wasn't set up to sort of be like, oh, well, I have the knowledge, you don't got the knowledge, and actually like foster like a strong sense of camaraderie and deeper understanding about politics and labor?
Yeah. And, I think this story, it should kind of give us a lot of hope because, again, we're talking about a workforce that was, many did not even graduate high school. So, many of us would probably maybe assume that there's no way a reading group would do well in this local, but it really did. And I think part of what the approach was, too, was to deal with kind of the compelling issues of the day. And, he would also kind of appoint people to, hey, go to this meeting. A. Philip Randolph is speaking, and come back and report to the membership. And then that person kind of gets more interested in what's going on. And, just dealing with whatever current issues is, don't just be, well, I'm the president of the union, I'm going to go and give the information back, get other members to start absorbing this stuff. And, to mention it again, I think a very inspiring example was them, a group of white workers reading a book about the civil rights movement and then being inspired to say, hey, we should, in our own company, they don't allow Black workers in this certain occupations. Let's fight for that. And they actually, uh, the majority of the membership actually was against it, but this kind of the leadership group took a stand and kind of forced it through. And this actually happened a lot with these kind of issues, even though there was kind of a big initial backlash from white workers. Very soon after, they kind of just get over it and it becomes pretty accepted. But this was all kind of stimulated by a reading group. I mean, one current example we have of that, go back to the Chicago teachers strike of 2012. That all started, that reform movement in the Chicago Teachers Union started with a reading group where they read, I think it was Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. They read a few other things. So we shouldn't underestimate the ability for reading and that kind of intellectual engagement to really spark real life organizing.
You also note in your piece too, like the merging of like labor with the political scene, and I'll just quote from something that Mazzocchi said to Leopold during the when they're writing the book. Quote: the union had to be more than a shop floor institution. It had to have a broader political understanding. I mean, I understood that corporations dominated the political scene, and that if you were going to fight effectively, people had to understand ideologically the need to deal with this huge corporate sector. I knew when I became president of the local, it was a fight for the minds of the people. I mean, could you talk maybe a little bit about like Tony's experience with this, and to maybe like from your own perspective, like being able to tie like these labor fights to like the political world where like corporations and corporate power really dominate?
Yeah, and I think this kind of comes into play with his approach to occupational safety and health, because for him, it was also this power issue. So, these companies have the ability to just determine what materials and chemicals we're going to work with. Doesn't matter the impact on workers or the broader community. So he kind of saw the fight for OSHA, which, by the way, he understood OSHA was very limited also. But he understood those fights as being, obviously for safety and health of people, but it's also about taking control back. And if these companies can just kind of have free reign to make us work in whatever conditions, that's taking away a lot of our power. And I think increasingly he saw, the reach of the corporate sector. In the book, it talks about as early as the late 1960s, he already saw that a lot of the chemical and oil plants his members worked in were very much automated, even to the point where a strike actually didn't affect them much. And so how he got around that was building up these broader anti-corporate campaigns that involved a lot of public support and public shaming. So I think he always just saw that, like, if we kind of don't attack that broader political element, we're always going to be a step behind. And that, I think, eventually is what led him to the Labor Party idea. And there's a great video on YouTube. I know I sent it to you, David. I think it's a video of him in like 1989 or something, talking about at one of his early Labor Party meetings. And, he said, which I think this all audience understands, is that, it's getting to the point like we can't bargain for good healthcare anymore. And he said, I challenge any union leader, even the best of them, and this is back in, again, the late 80s, to be able to make improvements on their healthcare plan. Whereas in Western Europe and other places, they're bargaining with the state. And we have to get to the, we're reaching the point where if we don't have a political reflection of the labor movement, we can be the best union organizers in the world, but we're going to get isolated and defeated. So I think that understanding kind of pushed them to this idea: we need to have some kind of labor party in this country. And again, I mean, this is an idea, we all think this, of course. He's been the person most recently to, again, it still failed, but he got, I think, the furthest along than anyone's been able to get in a very long time in this country.
I mean, not trying to pour cold water on it. I feel like probably further than any of the other demands. Like, people say, oh, we need a third party, we need a labor party in this country. Like, we all agree. But like, Tony actually had like the relationship and the embeddedness in labor to maybe start to build something that probably is more sustainable than, I don't know, some of the proposals we hear from folks today. That's just sort of like, I got a logo and a website, and we're going to have a Labor Party. You know?
Yeah. And I really encourage people, because again, this is coming up, I mean, for very good reason. Like, we all feel this need, like we need a Labor Party. So I totally understand it. But I really encourage people to read. Jacobin did an interview a long time ago with Mark Dudzik, who also came out of the same union, worked with Mazzocchi. Dudzik was also the head of labor for single payer. But interview with him, I think it's called "What Happened to the Labor Party." I think it's really good for people to read, just for the context, to just see that it's not just about us like wishing it to happen, or it's not just about willing it to happen. Like, there were a lot of structural factors that even made this like a possibility of a thought in the 90s. And it was also, I think, many structural reasons of why it ultimately failed. But I think it would be, people should look into that history, because I think it shows that, it's not just about us wishing it. There has to kind of be more things in motion for it to really become a reality.
Yeah. And I mean, I think like more than anything, it's just like you have to build the community, you have to build the class, right? And like that's sort of what Tony's like entire like organizing strategy seemed to be about. It was like, even in a place that's unionized, like you have to start to develop that consciousness within the union. And that's why you do things. And like I love, like personally, like I mean, there's so much to love about Tony's work, but like the idea of actually like showing up to other picket lines, not only in the sense of like, what you were highlighting about like how it gives people experience, it's intimidating your bosses, but it also is just like building this kind of, cross shop solidarity with people, right? It's like we're all in this fight together, which I think is something that's desperately needed.
Right.
But on that, like, I'm curious, since we have you on the program, Paul, I mean, to talk a little bit about some of the things that have been happening recently. I mean, like, there's been some really exciting, I think, developments in the labor movement in this country. Last week, we had a guest on. We were talking about some of the stuff that was happening in the UAW. Teamsters are in a similar track. I feel really bad. I don't have the video of the Teamster president at Congress, slapping around the senator from Oklahoma. I'm forgetting his name right now.
By the way, members, sorry to butt in real quick, but members love that video. I mean, it kind of reminds me of the guy in Britain, UK, the union leader,
Nick Lynch. Yeah.
And since I saw Amina in the chat, I'll shout her out, because I mean, she's talked about this too, about like, we need more union leaders that are combative, and like again, the members love it. I mean, they're all sending that video around like constantly. So anyway, just want to interject there.
No, I mean, I think that's like a huge point. I mean, like, this is what's so exciting. It's like, I mean, totally. I think that it's important to be more combative, but like the nice thing too is like it's also met with a bit of substance. And we open up the show. I'm just going to play it because it's fun. I don't mind watching it again. This quick video of Sean Fain, the new president of the UAW, and like everything about this, I love, both the message but also the music. Because I think this comes from the UAW's social media account too. They added some badass guitars into the background, which I think we need much more of that. But let me just play that for a second and hear your take.
But the UAW wasn't founded by asking for permission. The founders of this union didn't wait for the law. They didn't worry about the law. They wanted their dignity and they wanted their fair share, and they did what the hell they had to do to get it. The companies we deal with do not feel bound by the law. Ask a Starbucks worker who's been fired for organizing. Ask a Volkswagen worker in Tennessee whose boss threatened to close the plant if they unionized. Employers don't give a damn about breaking the law if it serves their interest. We've got to aspire to the spirit of our union's founders and the sit-down strikers and the civil rights movement. They knew there's no law that can hold back a united working class. There are no words on paper that will stand in the way of our fight for justice on or off the job.
Yeah, it's pretty good. And I got to say, I love the editing there so much. But I mean, like, I think this is such an important point to make. And like, it's certainly true in the labor struggle. I think it's also true in the political struggle. I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about how I'm very thankful to hear AOC, for example, saying that, like, hey, it's probably time that we start pushing back against the courts if they're going to try to curtail all of our rights. But I mean, like, Paul, I mean, I know this is like a broad question, but take it in a direction that you want. I mean, like, as somebody, you know, inside of these things, I mean, like, do you have a sense that, like, there might be a kind of change in the sense of, like, more militancy, more willingness to come up against the bosses, more willingness to, like, take on this kind of rhetoric when it comes to how working class people can and should fight against the overreach of capitalists and bosses?
Yeah, and first I'll say, like, with speech there, it's not just like good rhetoric. I mean, that it's actually objectively true and good history. I mean, the unions that we know of today were literally built from breaking the law, and not just industrial unions. In the 1960s, there was a wave of public sector struggles that formed the public sector unions we know today, of teachers, sanitation, down the list. And in almost every single case, it was a law that public sector workers couldn't strike and couldn't form a union. And they just struck anyway. And then the law was like, okay, I guess you can strike and form a union, So, I don't want to be too flippant about it. It's easier said than done. And usually these things happen in kind of a wave where more and more people feel emboldened. But it's just true that, like, there has to be a point where you're willing to kind of buck the law, but you just have to have enough mass support to do it. But I do think something is changing. I mean, the two biggest stories recently in the Teamsters and United Auto Workers, massive, two still very big industrial unions. So, with the UAW, a huge sea change just happened. The Reform Caucus, United All Workers for Democracy, UAWD, just won total control of the union. So people like Sean Fain and others who are willing to fight, be more combative. And honestly, I'll say this openly because the organizers have also said this openly. When UAWD ran a slate, their perspective was like, if we win like 2 seats on the board, that's a victory. They had no inkling that they would just win control. And I think it's a combination, I think, of some short-term factors and long-term trends. The long-term trend is that it's just been, for decades now, concession after concession in the auto industry, loss of jobs, creation of two-tier, where you have workers doing the same work as other workers getting paid on a different wage scale. So just all these concessions for forever. And then also most recently, there was a huge corruption scandal in the UAW that got exposed. And I think that was sort of the final straw. So you have that happening in the UAW, in 2021 in the Teamsters Union, the Teamsters United slate, which, Teamsters for a Democratic Union was a part of, won against the former Hoffa forces. Before that, Jimmy Hoffa Jr. was in charge of the union. And again, a combination, I think, of long-term trends where concession after concession over years. In 2018, the reform slate lost by a very, very small margin, which showed that there was gaining momentum. The last contract at UPS in 2018, a huge concession was made where two-tier was essentially allowed into the contract for the first time. And so this new election was a kind of reaction to that. And these leaders are being elected on the basis of being more militant, being more confrontational. We're already seeing it in the Teamsters. Most recently, Cisco, which is a grocery store company. There's been coordinated strike action, from Kentucky, Indianapolis, California, and that wasn't happening previously, and they've won better contracts because of that. We, of course, have the UPS contract coming up in August, and also with the Auto Workers Union, the what are called the big three automakers, so GM, Ford, and Chrysler, which apparently now is called something else, Stellantis or something.
Yeah, I can't remember. Yeah.
So those contracts are up in the fall. So, I wouldn't go as far as to say, like, okay, now everyone is ready to just like break every law there is. Unfortunately, at least, unlike the railway situation, Congress cannot force workers back to work in stuff like UPS and the auto workers. But I do think there is this growing sense of militancy and people being fed up. I do feel this broadly from people I work with in my own work that like there's only so much more we can keep conceding before what's the point. So I think there is this kind of, people are responding to this message of fighting back. it's hard to ignore. I mean, not only have this been happening for a long time, but when you add in the most recent struggles with inflation on top of it, it's like something has to give at some point. So, I don't want to get too excited too quickly, but I think, this summer and fall with UPS and the auto companies are going to be really.
Could you talk? Could you talk a little bit more about this UPS movement for folks who might not be familiar with it?
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing off the bat, Teamsters represent over 340,000 workers at UPS. So that is the biggest union contract in the country. And I think also what's powerful about it, it's a truly national contract. So UPS, whether it's Manhattan or a small town in Idaho or Montana, UPS has a presence, and there are UPS workers everywhere. So, having a fight like that or a strike like that, really touches the entire country. It's obvious how important UPS is economically. 5% of the country's GDP is moved by UPS every single day.
Wow.
And you can imagine, since COVID, we all are just sitting home ordering stuff. We've been sitting home ordering stuff. So that's only been increasing the importance of UPS to the economy. So I think it's going to be a big fight that will also kind of make waves throughout the labor movement, throughout the logistics industry. I think Amazon workers are going to be watching this fight to see what happens. And I think it's a key UPS. Like I said, in the last contract, 2 wages were introduced, so that the president has made very clear that's a strike issue. We need to get rid of 2-tier. But also, I think people should realize, when we think about UPS, we're probably thinking about the drivers. We see delivering packages, but the majority of UPS workers are part-time workers who work inside warehouses. Who sort packages and load them on the trucks. That's actually the majority of the workforce, and they, don't even make living wage in most cases. Also, a lot of them would like to be full-time warehouse employees, and the company keeps them part-time on purpose. So I think that's going to be really key is making these living wage jobs for the part-timers who are the majority, creating more full-time jobs. In the 1997 UPS strike, the slogan was "Part-time America won't work," and they created a lot more full-time jobs out of that. And they also had broad public support throughout. One thing I've kind of realized more and more, I mean, it should have been obvious, is we think about positions like teachers and nurses that seem to kind of be better placed to have public support. But, you think about the UPS drivers, I mean, they have a route. They really know the people well that they deliver to. And the small businesses, they're actually very popular figures. They were in 1997. I think they will be this time around. So yeah, I mean, this is going to be a big fight. And again, I think it's important not just for those UPS workers, but I think it could be like a big shot in the arm to the entire labor movement. I think, again, the auto workers can look at this and be inspired if the outcome is good. There's also some good, speaking of Mazzocchi and just transition, there's some good kind of cross-pollination happening. Right now, UPS wants to shift to electric vehicles, but they're using non-union labor. And now, Teamsters want to look at collaborating with this new UAW leadership to force UPS to use, union labor on these electric vehicles. So, a lot of opportunities I think are starting to open up.
I mean, it's truly exciting. I mean, in a lot of ways, like some of the more militancy and like willingness to fight back is more exciting than some aspects of, for example, maybe like the 2020 Bernie campaign for me. But like, this is like a broader question, Paul, but like, I think, and we posed it last week to our guests, but I wanted to ask you, because like, I think sometimes people have hesitation or anxiety or a difficulty knowing, particularly if you're outside, if you're just like a leftist, right? Knowing how to support and how to talk about these fights, right? Because like basically what's happening in the UAW, what's happening in the Teamsters is like, these are like unions that are becoming more democratic, right? That are listening more and more to their rank and file, that are opening it up. And that means that, these fights are happening. For a lot of lefties, I think, because they see how much on the back foot the union movement is, they're a little timid sometimes about talking about, oh, we need more democratization, we need more rank and file leadership. I mean, like, how do you walk that line as an advocate for labor and labor unions, and also somebody who wants to see, these things develop in maybe a somewhat of a different way than they maybe had over the past 20, 30 years? I'm just curious, like, if you have any sense of advice or orientation that people should have when they're thinking about these issues.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say in terms of an orientation and in terms of understanding, because I get it, it is in a sense like inside baseball, internal union
Mhm.
fights. I imagine it's harder to understand, like if you're not in that particular union or in the union in general. I mean, I think resources like Labor Notes, labornotes.org, they do stories. I mean, this is basically what they cover is like,
Mhm.
the internal union struggles for democratization and all that. I mean, I recommend people following them. And yeah, I mean, orienting towards it, it is tough because I think, if you are an outsider in a sense of like not a member of a particular union, it's not necessarily that helpful to be kind of criticizing for the outside or, but I think in terms of like, whether it's podcasts like this or other things like, trying to bring on whether it's workers who are involved in that kind of movement, themselves to talk about it. And I think in terms of an organizing thing, you know, I'm just going to use DSA as an example, like a DSA chapter. I actually think as much as I am kind of see myself as a part of this kind of sort of internal union reform effort, and I was, back when I was a teacher in my union, it's sort of, again, you don't really have much control over it if you're not in a union. So I think like
Mhm.
if you're a group like DSA chapter, I mean, you should really just try to work with the union that is there and whatever leadership exists to what you can, and just realize like you really won't be determining the fate. That's going to have to come internally from workers, which can be a difficult, balance maybe to strike sometimes. But I think it's just realizing that ultimately it's going to have to be the workers themselves in these unions who are going to try to make some kind of change. It can't really come from the outside.
Yeah. No, I think that's really well put. Well, Paul, will you keep us up to date with everything that's happening with the Teamsters over the next couple months? We'd love to have you back on to talk about that. And
Oh
folks, if
yeah,
you're not already following
absolutely.
Paul, there's ways to follow him on Twitter below. People should also read Paul. Paul put out a great piece recently. Jacobin, no, the GI Bill did not make racial inequality worse. That I think is really important,
A very
actually.
subtle title.
I loved it. I mean, look, I think it's important to push back. Like, there's a certain part of the liberal ruling class that like loves to like wage war on like good government policy.
Well, what was it? What was it? Hillary said like ending too big to fail won't cure racism or something like
Breaking up
that,
the
Yeah.
banks.
or bringing up the
Yeah.
banks. Yeah, and I
Yeah.
mean, as Paul said, like forming a union can go some way towards that. So there you go.
But people should definitely read that piece and all of Paul's work. And again, friend, thank you so much for spending some time with us tonight.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thanks,
All right,
Paul.
man. Talk to you soon. Dude, I sort of want to play that Sean Fade video again just to get that guitar. The guitar's so good.
It reminds me of like watching like guitar pedal videos where they're like sampling different types of distortion, and like the guy has like his own style, and it's like always like
But again, like really, thanks to Paul. That's really great. It's
Absolutely.
really nice. Paul's somebody who I think like really cares deeply about a lot of these issues and is committed to them. So I always appreciate hearing his perspective on all that. And yeah, we'll definitely be trying to cover as much as we can with the Teamsters fights that are coming up, because those are national. And if you're in a DSA chapter right now, I mean, hell, and you're trying to think, okay, what are good ways to get involved with labor and the labor struggle? I mean, this is a good time to get in touch with your Teamsters neighbors, because this is a fight that people are preparing for, that could be really huge, and like getting that groundwork, building those relationships right now in the months preceding a big contract fight, that can go a long way. So we'll definitely be trying to cover it from a few different angles on here, but that's something that you can sort of take with you after listening to the show tonight, of some way that you can start to get involved and start helping out. But folks, we're going to go to post game in just a second. Patreon.com/leftreckoning. Don't forget that you can leave us a message at 1-940-289-7234. But before we do that, we have another bit about AOC. We talked about her earlier because she was one of the signatures on the
signatories.
Signatories. I'm trying not to use. That sounds like a French word?
It is a big word. Yeah. I know. I understand.
French word.
Signatory.
I don't know if it's French or not, but I want to talk about. I want to talk about this segment that sort of went viral the other day of AOC on CNN, because I think it really hits on, like, one, some things that we need to do, and two, how this, like, death cult around the courts, which I'm going to call a death cult at this point because it's literally killing people. When we talk about them taking away the rights to abortion, I mean, the horror stories that we've been hearing here in Texas and all across the country of people having serious medical complications or passing away because they don't have access to medical care because this anti-woman Supreme Court decision came out. I mean, like, this is as serious as it gets. And the way I think that there's an opening right now, I think, even with like a traditional Democratic Party voters on this, but then you can see like a certain group of them sort of, shriveling up and defending the court. And, AOC got a lot of flack for this. And I think that Left Reckoning is the program that should say she's right here. And we could play a couple minutes of this interview she had with Anderson Cooper on the Supreme Court. I'm not on the Supreme Court, on the judicial branch in general.
When you've heard the news this afternoon, a couple hours ago, what did you think?
Wait, sorry. And just so people are up to date, this is in response to a Texas judge banning abortion medicine, trying to overrule the FDA decision that this is safe for people to use.
I think rulings like this, and I think we've seen from the FDA and also from activity in Congress, that some of these rulings, I think we've been preparing and anticipating for there being these egregious overreaches by members of the judiciary appointed by a right-wing Republican Party whose goal for a very long time was to just pack these courts with partisan judges, often underqualified or completely unqualified for their role. And so there has been thought, I believe, given to this. Senator Ron Wyden has already issued statements, for example, advising what we should do in a situation like this, which I concur, which is that I believe that the Biden administration should ignore this ruling. I think that the courts have the legitimacy and they rely on the legitimacy of their rulings. And what they are currently doing is engaged in an unprecedented and dramatic erosion of the legitimacy of the courts. It is the justices themselves, through the deeply partisan and unfounded nature of these rulings, that are undermining their own enforcement.
So you're saying the Biden administration should ignore this court, but what does that look like? What does that actually mean?
I think the interesting thing when it comes to a ruling is that it relies on enforcement. And it is up to the Biden administration to choose whether or not to enforce such a ruling.
But do we want to live in a world where a government can decide to ignore a federal court ruling?
Well, no, of course. I mean, I do think that it raises these important questions. And I do think that when we look at, and there are serious questions that the FDA and the Biden administration is going to have to figure out and how exactly we map this out. But on the other hand, what we are also seeing is a power grab over our courts in which the laws passed by Congress and the rules and policies passed by the executive branch now are going to require unanimous consent from 650 district court judges, many of which are appointed with even, the American Bar Association saying that they're completely unfit for the role.
Yeah, get them the fuck out of here. Yeah. I mean, that's what's so refreshing about that is to be spoken to like an adult, like an adult citizen of a democratic republic, nominally speaking, not some infant that has to be shocked by everything because we don't have object permanence in the political realm yet. Like, we have to act surprised and shocked and aghast. No, this is bullshit, and we need to treat it like bullshit.
I think I think it absolutely is, and I want to talk more broadly about stuff going on contemporarily today, Matt. But like, so almost immediately, this comes out, and there's a freak out. Like, oh, even Anderson, right, is saying, "Oh my lord, what if we do this? What a slippery slope! The entire fabric of our democracy will fall apart if we don't let these unelected people as far away from democracy as possible be able to overrule and just make unilateral decisions on like how we govern and live." um it is an affront to democracy. It was designed to be an affront to democracy. It was designed to be, if anything, a check on the quote unquote like mob. And Anderson Cooper asked, like, do you want to live in a country where like the government, the legislative branch or the executive branch can just overrule the court? And when I hear something like that, I'm like, well, do I want to live in a country where some fella in Texas can just decide that we're not going to be able to use basic medicine anymore? No, I don't. I think that's bad.
Ridiculous.
And, so anyways, you get all this hand wringing, particularly from like the section of the Democratic Party that hates AOC and Bernie and like these kind of movements. So it's like, they're not serious. They don't understand the laws. They don't understand the system. Well, I'll just say this right quick. Thank God that those people back in the 1800s didn't have the ear of the government when people were making the same arguments about slavery. And let's just look at this historical precedent that we have here. Here's a nice picture of Abraham Lincoln, a hero of the left. And this is coming from a piece by Matt Karp, who we've had on the program, How Abraham Lincoln Fought the Supreme Court. In 1857, a Southern majority Supreme Court ruled in the Dred Scott v. Sanford that Scott had no legal right to bring suit in federal court. That, in Chief Justice Roger B. Taney's famous words, colonial and U.S. history showed that Black Americans had no rights, which the white man was bound to respect. Equally inflammatory was the court's ruling that Congress had no constitutional right to ban slave property in the federal territories. This decision outlawed the national platform of the anti-slavery Republican Party, which was premised on blocking slavery's expansion to the West. Slaveholders and their allies, including Democratic President James Buchanan and the overwhelmingly Democratic U.S. Senate, embraced the decision as a final settlement of the slavery question. Taney had proclaimed Dred Scott, quote, the law of the land, and the ruling party and government agreed with him. Abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, meanwhile, condemned the decision as judicial incarnation of wolfishness. Yet they knew that the problem of pro-slavery Jewish jurisprudence could not be solved by anti-slavery jurisprudence alone. We can appeal from this hell-black judgment of the Supreme Court, said Douglas, to the court of common sense and common humanity. The remedy for Dred Scott did not reside in a lawyer's plea or a judge's opinion, but in mass political struggle. And I'll just say there, I agree with Douglas 100% in that case, and I think in general when it comes to the court. But let's look at how Lincoln and the Republicans dealt with the court. Across the late 1850s, Lincoln argued that the American people, not the Supreme Court, were the true arbiters of the Constitution, and that the only way to defeat the pro-slavery judiciary was through mass political struggle. And after Lincoln and Hamlin were elected in 1860, the new president's inaugural address articulated this view in the strongest language he ever used. This is Lincoln. If the policy of the government upon vital questions affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed by decisions of the Supreme Court, the instant they are made, the people will have ceased to be their own rulers, having to that extent practically resigned their government into the hands of that eminent tribunal. I think that should be emblazoned. That should be, on all courts in the land, right? That is as simple as it gets.
Exactly. And that's true whether we had slavery or not. And the fact is that we did. So like, I have no problem tarring the Supreme Court as like a slavery rubber stamping institution, but that just as a matter of civics, we should not debase ourselves and abdicate that kind of power to judges, particularly judges selected by a political class that's already insulated from democratic pressure.
And let's look again, like these arguments that we're getting from people saying to AOC, saying that like, I don't think that a judge in Texas should be able to ban medicine, are very similar to things that Stephen Douglas was saying to Lincoln, quote, when they were in their famous debates, Douglas accused Lincoln's party of seeking, quote, to destroy public confidence in the highest judicial tribunal on earth. From that decision, there is no appeal this side of heaven. Yet Mr. Lincoln says he is going to reverse that decision. By what tribunal will he reverse it? Will he appeal to a mob? Right? Again, this is what the courts are at the end of the day.
Yep.
It's something to stand between like the people and rule. Right. And you see it from the beginning of our founding documents. That's how all of these checks on popular will are always described. It's law and order versus the mob, the unruly masses. Right. And look, as a socialist, I'm very happy to stand with the quote unquote mob and with the people over a bunch of fancy lads in gowns.
Just to remind people where the word mob comes from, it literally, like, from the 18th century, was short for mobile vulgus, which is like the vulgar movement of, like, sort of, the common people. Like, that's like that. It was like elites talking about that, and it's still used the same way today.
On the question of Jeffrey says, on the question of slavery, got to side with the mob on that one. I mean,
agree. The mob's pretty fucking undefeated, I got to tell you.
So what does Lincoln and the Republicans do? Because obviously you think the Supreme Court that they inherited was some nice little, Supreme Court that was going to play ball with things like the Emancipation Proclamation and ending slavery in this country. Once in power, Lincoln and congressional Republicans reorganized the federal judiciary and packed the court, adding an additional justice. But more fundamentally, they simply ignored pro-slavery precedents established in the 1850s. In June 1862, for instance, Congress passed and Lincoln signed a bill banning slavery from the federal territories, a direct violation of the majority ruling in Dred Scott. The court meekly acquiesced, recognizing that its political power was long since broken. As a legal historian Charles Warren later lamented, Republicans' popular assault on the court crippled the institution for more than a decade. He wrote, during neither the Civil War nor the period of Reconstruction did the Supreme Court play anything like its due role of supervision, with the result that during the one period, the military powers of the president underwent undue expansion, and during the other, the legislative powers of Congress. The loss of confidence in the court was due not merely to the court's decision, but to the false and malignant criticisms and portrayals of the court, which were spread widely through the North by influential newspapers. Obviously, that person is against, things like Reconstruction and the equal rights in the radical period of Reconstruction in this country. But the point is that thank
those
God.
woke northern newspapers. Oh, sorry.
No, the woke northern newspapers, and thank God that the radical Republicans didn't listen to the course of their time and the course that is now echoed by folks today saying you can never touch the court, right? We have a system of checks and balances, but it's checks and balances when the court overrules democratic mandates, when the court bans very popular medical procedures, when the court wages war on people's basic civil liberties and rights. That's checks and balances. But when a member of the legislature says, hey, I think the courts have overstepped their mandate and overstepped their role, oh my Lord, the constitutional system is in crisis, right? I mean, it is absolutely insane. And if you look at the history of this country, we would be in a far worse society had people in power with the democratic mandate that the Republicans had at that period of time listen to those naysayers who said, don't touch the court, right? Because, we have to let them do whatever they want. Yeah, if they want to say black people aren't human, we have to respect that because these people have degrees and the mob can't make decisions about the future of this society, right? Fundamentally, these are questions about democracy. Fundamentally, I think that there is no greater threat to democratic rule. I'm not talking about the party. I'm talking about like the people having power in this country than the Supreme Court and just in fact, generally the entire judiciary at this point, right? I think that the whole reason you have elections, the whole reason that you put these things up to a vote, the whole reason that you trust people to make decisions is so we can make those decisions. Now,
there's your judges.
If I already, if you're already following the argument, fine. I think the historical precedent for this is very clear, actually, that thank God they took that position in the past. But if there are any more naysayers, I will just say this, right? Well, how do you protect against the tyranny of the majority to the minority, right? One, this is like one of the biggest lies in American history, right? That the court was somehow historically standing with the minority over the majority. That's just not true. You look at the entire the history of the Supreme Court is the history of it rubber stamping the most brutal aspects of American empire, right? Like, if you wanted to have, like, if the history of this court, for example, was like pushing back against slavery, was pushing back against FDR's internment camps and doing things like that, then maybe you'd have an argument. But that's not how it has functioned historically.
Yeah.
And
no, I just put a plug in on that point? Like Ian Millhiser, who is, he's not a leftist. He's like a liberal sort of, I don't know if Media Matters or Think Progress, I think is where he's from. But like run-of-the-mill Democrat sort of writer. But his book, like Injustice, is the Supreme Court's history of comforting the comfortable and afflicting the afflicted. Like you say, this is not controversial. That's the line on the Supreme Court.
And even things like that people like to look at, like Roe v. Wade, for example, like people act as if Roe v. Wade was something that sort of came out of the wisdom of the Supreme Court. No, Roe v. Wade happened because there were mass movements that were pushing and winning abortion rights all across this country, right? What that was the Supreme Court being pushed in a certain direction by the public. And if you look at the vast majority of, like, let's say, positive Supreme Court rulings on those kind of things, they didn't happen in a vacuum. They didn't come because the Supreme Court one day woke up and decided, all right, we're going to push for this, we're going to push for that. They were in response to mass movements, just like when Lincoln and all of them were banning slavery in this country. The court realized it had lost the ability to rule in this way. And the Supreme Court now, I think, has the opinion that it can get away with this kind of stuff because, as you've seen, for the most part, for the Democratic Party, it's been silenced despite the mass unpopularity of some of the recent decisions of the Supreme Court. Right. And just lastly, like, this is like the most like hot, pie in the sky talk. But like people are always like, well, if you don't have the courts, then we can just like fall into tyranny. Well, I think if you look at the long history of the United States of America, you can see that believing that the court should have this power over democracy has not delivered the thing that you're asking for. Right. And in fact, more often than not, has done the opposite. So yes, there is no guarantee in democracy that democracy will be a good one, or that democracy will deliver the results that we want, right? That's the tough thing about democracy. But what will prevent that from ever happening, actually being able to live in a democracy that delivers for people, that does good things for people, is if you have a system where unelected folks can sit on top of society outside of politics and sort of dictate and act without any repercussions for their actions. We are long overdue in this nation for a serious curtailing of the power and the overreach of the judiciary, something that happened early in this country, and they've basically been able to walk freely, except for in moments like what happened with maybe FDR, or except in moments that happened with Lincoln and the radical Republicans, right? So yeah, I think it's a fair point to make. But what I'm saying is that, like, it's a false safety to think that the Supreme Court is going to be acting in the interest of people. We have seen the historical legacy, the historical record is clear at this point. You have to put these things into the democracy. You have to fight those fights and win those fights. It's not, what I'm saying is that, like, it's not a guarantee that there won't ever be overreach from like a legislative body or the executive branch, right? But that's a fight we can have. Where in this system, you have people outside of politics who, for whatever reason, we're told we can't touch. That don't work. It doesn't work. And we're seeing it play out and the negative effects for millions of people right now.
Yeah, I mean, this is just a quirk of the U.S. Constitution fundamentalism, which is judicial review. The court should not be able to tell a legislature and an executive branch, hey, that law you just voted on and passed, you being elected representatives of this republic, you couldn't have done that, actually. Like, no. That should not be allowed, and it, like the bar for that sort of thing, they should be able to review on like smaller things. But and I'm just reading like one of the like we mentioned the reasons of supposed virtues of judicial review. Further, judicial review also provides a powerful counter-majoritarian force, so that the one governmental branch whose personnel are not subject to the prevailing political climates or special interests which like that's conflation of two things. One, we'll talk about in the post game.
Yeah, we know about special interests. Yeah,
Harlan Crow, who's bankrolling like Clarence Thomas and his wife and everybody else in the conservative movement. Yeah, that's special interest. Harlan Crow's folks have never gotten our perfect 1,000% batting average in front of Clarence Thomas. But like, I don't think we need any more checks on the fucking wills of the people. I think the people actually, like, relative to like say maybe the 60s, when you actually look at the public, you're like, like this is like, and I just to say I would have been for the people, like for part of the mob even then too. Americans' attitudes on all sorts of these things are way more progressive on all this stuff. So like, yeah, like it's time to get rid of that shit.
I'm going to say, two things, and I think that people should, recognize this. This is like a positive thing for our kind of movement. The American working class and the American public is probably amongst one of the more progressive globally when it comes to issues of identity, when it comes to a lot of these things, like really does like lead the way. So again, like also like, if you have fears of the people, then I don't think that you can call yourself a socialist.
Right.
But two, like the facts of the matter are that like the American public is like incredibly progressive across the board. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying there's things that like are not troubling. But like really we do have a population here that is incredibly progressive, and I think people should own that. Also, Seth makes a great point here too, doing a little cross country political analysis, that judicial review to the scope that America allows it is quite unique to America. And this is true. And this is another thing where it's important to recognize that Charles is making fun of the way I say recognize, but making fun of it's important to recognize that that like this is unique. Like this is not something that happens in other countries. You have this unelected group of elderly folks basically having a veto power over American democracy. This is a truly American experience, and it's one of those things. It's like all of the slippery slope arguments that you get when you talk about weakening the power of the judiciary. It's like, okay, well, we're not on an island. There are other countries that don't have this power, and they don't devolve into the same kind of tyranny. And again, you can't make that argument in the goddamn American case. We had people like being owned by other people. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, tyranny.
Like,
thanks, courts.
What the fuck are you talking about?
And yeah, even the moment, like it's funny, AOC mentioning like the enforcement. Somebody's got to enforce it. Well, what does that remind us from history? Andrew Jackson saying like, "Oh, you don't want me to dispossess Native Americans? Well, fucking, what are you going to do about it?" And that's exactly like. Frankly, like that shows like even in the best case scenario when it should have been working, it doesn't. So it's a lie that it actually does that sort of like counter tyrannical force. So get it out of the fucking paint, because like as we can see, we've run the experiment here, and like except for a brief moment post Great Depression, this thing is trash, and there's fundamental reasons to expect it to continue so.
So what I'll say here is like, I think that we've made the case well, and we've done this. And in fact, if people want more on this, like we had Matt Karp on the program probably a year or so ago to talk about that very piece. So if you want a more in-depth look at the history there, you can watch that video. But like, why are we bringing this up? One, because there's public discourse around it, but two, I genuinely believe that there is an opening right now with folks. Even like MSNBC watchers, people we typically like tease on this program, they're furious about living under this kind of system. So seeing an AOC come out there on a public program on Anderson Cooper, whatever, making those points, I think is really good. And what we should be, what is the role of the left? What is the role of socialists? To keep hammering home those points and trying to, continue to like grow this fissure where more and more people are saying like, yeah, we probably should be weakening the power of judicial review, because that's the only way that it's going to break. Is if there's more and more demands, just like in the case of Lincoln and the Radical Republicans. Basically what happened is the courts knew they couldn't fuck with the people anymore, because the people were so clearly on one side, the government was so clearly on one side, the elected government was so clearly on one side. This is exactly the time for doing agitation, for doing political education, for tweeting, right? For doing all the things that people sometimes get mad about, the online left or whatever you want to call it, for is like only doing discourse, only doing that or that. This is literally the time where that can have a lot of effect, and continue doing that kind of work of saying, we can't allow this to continue anymore. I think there's more political openings than some people think on these issues, because like the abortion ruling, I think really opened up the door for some very serious discussions on changing the way that our system is set up. And like, look, you know, going back to Bernie, Green New Deal is going to get tied up in the courts. Medicare for All is going to get tied up in the courts. Everything that like, and we need to start doing that work to weaken those powers before that moment. So in the moment right now where we don't have a Bernie Sanders campaign to rally around, like this is a very critical moment to actually start to open up those doors, so that when we do have a national movement that's able to come to power and deliver these kind of things, you know, we've started to conquer the power of the courts over democracy.
Yeah, and I like your framing. Like this is a time to like it's to help us stand up taller on our 2 feet as citizens, and not be infantilized by people in robes that spent a whole bunch of
That's
time.
right, dude. It's
hitting the gavel.
infantilizing. It's
Yeah.
infantilizing to say you aren't responsible enough to have a democracy. Is basically what that argument boils down to, right? They use flowery language, but they're saying we don't trust y'all to be in charge, and we need to have our representatives from Harvard or et cetera, you know, to be there. So continue pushing, folks. That was good. And look, we'll criticize members of the squad when they do bad things, but today, I mean, that was great from AOC, and them all signing that letter saying that Assange should be charging as Assange should be dropped. Great. So we'll celebrate those things when they happen. Folks, we're going to jump over to the post game. We'll put the links up on Patreon, and I usually try to post it on Discord as well. We'll be over there in about 10 minutes or so. Leave us a message at 1940-289-7234. Please consider, if you aren't already, becoming a patron. You know, it really helps us grow. Matt and I have some, you know, big ideas that we want to do, but we've been sort of sitting at the same place for a while. That sort of slowed us down a little bit. We really want to be expanding, maybe doing some more live interviews and things like that. So consider being a patron. If you don't want to become a patron, or you don't want to make that kind of long-term commitment, you can grab a hat or t-shirt. We have awesome Left Reckoning hats. We have our LR on the road shirt. All these good things you can get over there at leftreckoning.com/store. Appreciate all of y'all so much. Thank you so much, Paul, for coming on. Thank you, Chip, for coming on. Both of them for all the work that they do. And yeah, we'll be over in the post game in just a couple minutes. So come see us.
Peace.